Hello everyone and welcome back to the Arsenal Pass YouTube channel. It is Hayden here, and we are just less than a week out from ProQuest Season 5, ProQuest qualifying season for Amsterdam, kicking off and coming hot off the heels of a couple of pretty big seasons. Pro Tour LA and the calling in LA just wrapped up a couple of weekends ago prior to Easter. Also, of course, had Road to National season. It's been a busy start to the year for Flesh and Blood off the back of heavy hitters, and personally, I think what a set and what an impact the set has had, particularly in Class Constructed, and looks to continue to impact it as we head towards the next set in Part of the Mistveil. So, ProQuest Season 5. Going to go through some top decks to play. These decks, honestly, are just what I think are kind of the 5 best decks in the format right now, post-Dromai. I'm going to talk a little bit pre-Dromai and post-Dromai with this analysis video. Now, one of the things is that Dromai is likely to Living Legend in the first week of ProQuest. If you haven't already sort of picked up on this, or you haven't heard or haven't seen where Dromai is on the Living Legend side of things, it is really close to Living Legend after Trehay's win at Pro Tour LA. And if it wins this coming weekend, as I'm recording, at the Calling Phuket, then it will hit Living Legend, and it won't be available for week 1 of ProQuest season. Now, if that doesn't happen, then we will see it for week 1 of ProQuest season. Also, a couple of Battle Hardens happening next weekend for ProQuest ProQuest week 1, season 5. So very, very likely that we will not have Dromai after week 1. And that's the assumption I'm going to work with in this video. So we're going to talk all things from the pros, the cons of playing these 5 decks that I'm going to go through, meta considerations as well, and what I might change for the specific metas, including if you want to take this deck into week 1 of the ProQuest season, or if you want to take it into a post-Dromai meta. So we're going to talk both things on that. And then we're going to talk sort of core of the plans of these decks. And these decks, I think, are very, very strong, and the decks I'll be looking at right now for ProQuest Season 5 heading towards Amsterdam. Now, before I get into things, if you aren't already subbed to the channel, of course, make sure you do so. Go and click that like and subscribe button. We really appreciate it. If you like all the things we do here at Arsenal Pass, podcast, videos, etc., we've got a lot of videos coming out for you over the next few weeks, including deck techs with Pro Tour top 8 competitors, some of our own deck techs, and a range calling champions. We've got a lot of deck techs coming your way, and a couple of those deck lists actually featured, or I guess similar deck lists featured in this video, so something to look out for. But first of all, let's get into it and take a look at the meta breakdown and sort of key considerations when it comes to the meta for ProQuest Season 5. One of the things I really like to do when it comes to trying to understand what a metagame might look like for an upcoming event is to look backwards. So I want to start with the Road to Nationals meta. Road to Nationals happening just, finishing up in the last month, and some pretty interesting results, I think. Ultimately, we don't have the play data, but what we do have is the hero wins from that Road to National season. And if you haven't already seen it, no real surprise. Dromai's been kind of king or queen, really, to start this first half of the year, or this first part of the year. Dromai, 37 wins in the Road to National season, closely followed by Kayo at 35, before you see a pretty steep drop-off into Victor. So the top 3 heroes through Road to National season were Dromai, Kayo, and then Victor. And pretty soundly, Dromai and Kayo, which we saw kind of translate to the PT. So I think that kind of shows some good conversion data heading into really big professional events as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the calling as well. So I think it's a good place to start, knowing that Dromai is going to head into Living Legend, but week 1, I would expect to see a lot of Dromai, partly because it's maybe the best deck in the format still, but also because people aren't going to be able to play it in Class Constructed after week 1. I think you'll see a lot of maybe extra people who might not have played Dromai, play Dromai in week 1 so they can get their time in playing Dromai before sunsets into Living Legend. Now, after the top 3 heroes at Road to National season, Victor being 3rd, you see Katsu, 23 wins alongside Kano. They sort of round at the top 5 of the Road to Nationals win results before you get into things like Bravo and then Kassai, Sir Bolton, and then Azalea. So I think from Road to National season, what I take from that is that we went into Pro Tour LA and the calling LA with Kayo, Dromai, Kayo, and Victor being kind of the top 3 decks. When you look at Pro Tour LA from a metagame standpoint, Kayo ended up being 20% of the meta at the event, and we all know that, in the end, number of KOs in the top 8, including making, the semifinals. Dromai at 13%, ultimately winning Pro Tour LA, and then it was a real steep drop-off at Pro Tour LA to Dory in 3rd place, actually. So a bit of a surprise seeing Dory there, and I think Dory is something we're going to see in ProQuest Season 5, but 7.5%. Victor actually, dropping off, I guess. Wins don't mean representation, but Victor, the 4th most played deck at the PT, followed by Azalea and Dash. When you look at some of the heroes that did well in Road to National season, Kano. A little bit less represented at just 5%. The 9th most played deck. Kassai, the 10th most played deck. Bravo, 11th. And then you look all the way down, pretty far down for Boltyn, which I think a lot of people wouldn't be surprised about. Boltyn might have really good results in maybe more open kind of metas, but in a closed meta like Pro Tour LA, maybe a little bit less. When you look at the calling, Kayo, Dromai, 1 and 2 again, but Victor was number 3. So the open events that you see with Road to Nationals and calling, they kind of look pretty similar. Kayo, Dromai, Victor, the top 3 decks from a placing standpoint in the Road to National season, and then you look at the calling from a representation standpoint, those same 3 heroes at the top there. I think the one that stands out as interesting to me after Kassai in 4th place at the calling LA is actually Leviah and then Katsu. Leviah showing up a little bit, although maybe didn't have the results necessarily. That's kind of the lay of the land heading into ProQuest season. In terms of what I expect at ProQuest season, I expect for week 1, Dromai and Kayo to be kind of playing off as the top 2 most played and probably top performing decks in week 1 of ProQuest season. However, after Dromai hits that Living Legend, if it doesn't already before week 1, once we get into week 2, I expect Kayo to still be top dog, but I expect to see a little bit of a shakeout. I expect decks that were quite bad or had a bad matchup into Dromai to start to rise up. Just naturally makes sense, right? But also things that are maybe counters or good into Kayo had weak Dromai matchups. So I think, honestly, the Warriors are kind of where I'm looking to. I don't think the Warriors had particularly great Dromai matchups, and they were super skill intensive on the Warrior side. So I expect to see the Warriors kind of rise up in week 2. I actually expect to see the Guardians fall away. Victor in particular, who had a fairly good matchup into Dromai, kind of one of its maybe reasons to play the deck. A little bit kind of coin flipping into Victor. Coin flipping into Kayo, but very good into Warrior. So I think on the whole, Victor's maybe slightly down on where it was. And then the other brutes, I think Leviah and Rhinar both kind of get a bit of a bump. And I think the Ninjas actually get a little bit of a decrease with Dromai hitting out. Azalea probably stays somewhere around the same spot, and it really depends on how aggressive format or your local meta is going to be. So I think that's kind of how the meta is going to shake out. Weeks 1 to 2, there's going to be a bit of transition, but I think Kayo, Dromai, of course, in week 1, the Warriors, a little bit of Guardian, and I think the other 2 decks, Kano and Prism, I think they get a really sizable bump from Dromai hitting out of the format. So I expect to see them really pick up in weeks 2 and 3 and 4. And then Dash is kind of an unknown for me, but I think Dash is so good just as a hero that I think we're going to see a reasonable amount of Dash have success. In terms of the other decks, I think, anything can win. We've seen it through the Road to National season, but they're probably on the fringes for me, and that's the kind of meta that I'm focusing on. Let's get into the first hero and the first deck list that I want to show you, and it's going to be Kassai. I think Kassai, after Dromai hits Living Legend, might be the best deck in the format. Now, I've kind of been a little bit unspoken on my views that Kassai just is kind of an only okay hero. During testing, I wasn't a big fan of Kassai. We had a number of players on our sort of wider testing group end up on Kassai at Pro Tour LA, and ultimately one of those, Matt Dilks, who was a pioneer in our group on the Kassai list, played it for a very long time, did a lot of work on it, ends up winning the calling in LA. Just want to big shout out to Matt there. We're going to look at Matt's list and then talk a little bit about pre and post Dromai. But I think particularly post Dromai, Kassai is in a really good spot, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's bring up Matt's deck list. I do want to say as well, if you want to hear more about Matt's kind of approach to Kassai and his calling win and the deck list, we are going to have up on the channel a deck tech with Matt, including a full sideboard guide up on our Patreon, as we always do with our deck techs. Now, let's take a little look at Matt's list here. And I think one of the things that stand out first to me in a pre versus post Dromai world is 12 poppers. At some points during testing, I know we had like 14, 15 that the guys are working on in terms of poppers in their list, really trying to secure that Dromai matchup. I think with Dromai heading away, you get some space to cut some of these poppers. Now, I wouldn't say initially you want to cut them all or cut majority. A couple of reasons for that. I think some of them are just good cards in Kassai. I've come around quite significantly personally on Nourishing Emptiness, but CNC, a very good card in this format. So maybe, you keep those 6 poppers, good against Prism as well, but maybe you get 6 extra card slots. And I actually think that's massive for Kassai, because one of the problems I was personally having with Kassai, just looking at this list, you'll notice is that there's not a lot of attack reactions that actually get to push your current attack over the threshold and get you that gold. Now, one of the ways that Kassai really gets above rate and gets significant advantage during a game is landing a massive Raise the Army or a really big Blood on Our Hands turn. Both are really strong, but those both require having the currency, the coin, right, to be able to play them, the gold or the copper. And you're not going to get those if you're not getting the on hits. And if you don't have attack reactions to push over some of these really significant turns of on hits, your opponent can kind of play the game where they kind of starve you on the currency, they starve you on the coin. Whereas with a few more attack reactions, which is kind of what I would be adding in to Kassai heading forward, to push over those gold, to push over those key Kassai turns, because you can only activate Kassai so many times. There's only so many yellows, and you only want to play so many yellows because they are kind of average. You want to make sure that every time you activate that Kassai ability, you get the value out of it. So attack reactions can really help with that. So you see in the list, we have things like 2 in the swing, really great for pushing through Kassai on the second blade hit. I'd probably be looking to maybe take that up to 3. Maybe even the stroke of foresight, which is at 2, taking that up to 3. And then probably adding in 3 more attack reactions, probably in the red slot, or maybe in the yellow slot to take out for some of these yellows, these yellow poppers that might get cut out. But I think that's where I would ultimately be looking. Overpower was one that was quite interesting to me. I know testing partner Dan Mackay, he's really high on route, for instance. Maybe you even go for another 1 cost or even a 0 cost. But I think what I'd be looking at is definitely putting in some extra attack reactions there over some of these poppers. Otherwise, I think this list is super tuned, super well tested from the team. One thing you could do is you could cut a little bit of the go again, because you don't need as much go again because of no Dramai. So things like blue hit and run, for instance, might be something that comes out. Even blue precision press, although that card is actually pretty good. And then when I look at yellows, you could even maybe trim down on a yellow go again, for instance. But I think there is some space in this deck list, but overall it's really, really strong. And I think the card that really stands out to me, if you look from a game plan standpoint, is Grains of Bloodspill from an equipment standpoint. And then really what you're trying to do is utilize the value of Valiant Dynamo, getting that extra 1 every turn, kind of adding up that turn cycle damage on defense plus your offense. Often you're doing like 2 card 7s with your blades. And if your opponent wants to block, they block with attack action. Tari Saber gets that pump over the top. You've got other pumps, you've got other kind of combat tricks, you've got Kassai ability, all these things, and then eventually trying to land a big blood on a hands turn or a big raise an army to kind of push through grindy game states and win the game. So yeah, I think Kassai honestly might now be positioned post Dramai as, if not the best deck, they're definitely one of the best decks in this format. Next up, is it any surprise? It's got to be Kayo. Kayo is not going anywhere, had a breakout performance through the Road to National season, but honestly, it wasn't really surprising. Really kind of, dominated part of Road to National season, had a very, very good showing at Pro Tour LA, of course, plus the calling in LA, and doesn't look like it's going to go anywhere. And in fact, getting some extra help with the Kayo Armory deck, adding a couple of new cards in. Now let's take a look at Joel Riptor's list from Pro Tour, the highest placing Kayo, highest placing Kayo at that event, and also someone who worked in our wider testing group. And actually, if you are looking for a bit more insight on how to play Kayo, how to build things pre and post Dromai, a little bit more in-depth than just this top line in this video, we do have Joel coming on the channel to do a deck tech with Brendan in the next week. So keep an eye out for that. Of course, also on the Patreon, we'll have a full deck guide. Now, I think one of the contentious things with Kayo in this format has really been around cast bones. How many cast bones do you play? We saw some teams, including the Wolfpack, playing 0 cast bones. Some people swearing by 3 because the card is so powerful. Ultimately, I know the wider group that we were in landed somewhere between 0 and 3. Joel UC plays 2, and then depending on the matchup, how many actually got played. The card is phenomenal when it goes off, but sometimes it can be clunky. You don't want to draw it off your things like Wild, Ride, and Pulping. So I think going forward, ultimately, I think that you've got to play minimum 2. I think the card is too powerful, especially in kind of grindy matchups like against Guardian. Potential matchups, I think you've got to have access to that card, but maybe 3 is too many. In terms of, I guess, what I might change about this list in a post, I think in a pre-Dromo world, I think this list is really, really strong. I think the down but not out can kind of go, and I think ultimately that was a last kind of a slot inclusion, 80th kind of card that the team were working on. If you look at Seb Grondale's list, who top aided, was also in the wider testing group, decided not to play the down but not out, and honestly, I think I would just do away with the down but not out, especially now that people know about the card. What I would do though, I think, is maybe add in an extra red popper for week 1 for Dromai. So something like a Smash Instinct even, and then probably cut that back after week 2. In terms of the post Dromai, otherwise I think pre Dromai this list is fantastic, and what I would go with post Dromai LL, I think what you can start to do is you can start to cut down on maybe some of the sideboard slots or some clunky 6s. Although Joel didn't play a ton of these. But things like, even when I look at things like the 2 agile wind-up yellows, maybe you don't need those anymore. The runner, maybe you... runner is actually an interesting card. I found that card to be, when it's on, obviously super powerful, but I actually think in Kayo is kind of not that great. I think that card is a lot better actually in Reiner, interestingly. Stay tuned for that. But yeah, you'll see Joel has a split of 2 yellow Bear Fangs, 1 red Bear Fang. I think that's kind of up to interpretation. Actually, the one thing I look at Joel's list is I would probably add in a Nuller and Gloves. So if I cut the down but not out, I'd probably add a Nuller and Gloves regardless. But otherwise, I think this list is in a really good spot. Like I say, he doesn't play too many extra poppers, but maybe you could cut back on some of the extra 6 attacks, natural 6 attacks. I think one thing I really like about this list is 22 blues. I really don't think you can play less than 22 blues. I know we've seen the list with 21, we've seen the list with 20. I think if you're looking at this, my advice is play the 22 blues. We take a look at the equipment here. Gambler's Gloves, I think in the post-Dromo world, you can cut those. You don't need them as much. You basically only play them in that matchup. But if you're expecting a lot of Prism, you might want to keep them, for instance. Hardened Cross Trap is great. The sort of Kano setup for that matchup is like Spellfray Gloves, Spellfray Leggings, Skullhorn for AB2, and the Hardened Cross Trap. I think it makes your matchup like fairly reasonable into Kano. Whereas I think without those, it can be kind of poor, honestly. I think it can actually be a good matchup for Kano. Whereas I think this list is slightly favored into Kano. So yeah, I think overall, I think this is a great starting point. I think Joel and the rest of the group that landed on this list kind of nailed it. But there's a couple of changes in a post-Dromo world that I think you can make. So while I think that Kayo and Kassai in a post-Dromo world are number 1 and number 2 for the top 2 decks in the format, at least in my view right now, I think third slot or kind of that next group of heroes is kind of open, honestly. And I think I'm going to show 3 decks that I think could be third most powerful deck. They could even potentially be the best deck in the format, depending on how things shake out and how people kind of tune and work on these decks. But I'm going to start with Kano. I think Kano is been in a really good spot. Talked about this quite a reasonable amount on the podcast and led up to Pro Tour LA. I thought it was in a good position. Ultimately, top 8 PTLA, we see a Kano. Second place at the Calling LA at PTLA, we see a Kano as well. And that's the list I'm going to show you. We're going to look at Caleb's list from second place at the Calling. And I think this is just a very good stock standard place to start. Honestly, if you've been looking at Kano lists before, or if you kind of look around at other Kano lists people play, I think this is kind of pretty standard. The only thing that I think is interesting is they play the one of Imperial Edict to kind of stop the kind of pitch stack or the anti-pitch stack kind of idea of that. If people have multiple Oasises or things like that, then you can play Imperial Edict and kind of stop that turn where they try and stop your combo or your pitch stack combo. But otherwise, I think the kind of list is pretty standard, and I really like this list. Red Snapback is a card that some people do like, some people don't like. I think with the kind of inclusion of Threadbare Tunic in particular, over playing something like the Spellfray Cloak that people played previously, Threadbare Tunic basically allows you to kind of do stuff on your own turn. So if your opponent kind of, for whatever reason, goes shields down on your turn, you can still pop off with Threadbare Tunic, or you can even pop off with a Threadbare Tunic on your turn, things like Snapback, and then still have Ragamuffin's Hat and your Storm Striders on their turn if they have no cards left to actually just kill them with a Wildfire combo, for instance. So the deck has become more dynamic. I think Kano is kind of a slow progressor when it comes to, I guess, iterations and evolution, but that's because I think Kano kind of past 2 years has been 80-90% solved, I would say. Like, it's been in a really, really strong position. The meta has just gotten better for it. And I think in a post-Dromo world, it loses one of its worst matchups. Ultimately, I actually don't think Dromo was a particularly bad matchup for Kano, but I think it's a sub 50 matchup for Kano. And every time you lose one of those matchups, it is probably going to be good for you, unless the meta shifts to pick up in decks that you're also not very good against. And the one that might be a bit of a concern is Prism, the rise of Prism. So that is probably Kano's worst matchup, honestly. So if you expect a lot of Prism to rise up, which I'm expecting a reasonable amount of Prism to rise up, Kano gets a little bit weaker there. But ultimately, if the kind of a lot of warriors that take that kind of meta share that Dromo's leaving behind, then I think Kano just gets even better. So right now for me, Kano's going to be kind of in that top 3. I think it's a deck to look at, definitely. I think the deck is also, if you've never looked at Kano before, people say it's kind of intimidating, it's hard to play. Honestly, Kano is not that hard to play, especially at kind of like a 85 to 90% proficiency. The last 10%, yes, it can be very difficult, but that's the same with any hero and almost any deck in Flesh and Blood. If you're looking for a place to start, we do have our Ultimate Kano Guide. Over a year old now, but it has the fundamentals of the combo, the Wildfire math, just how to get started playing Kano. You can go and check that out on our channel. But yeah, I'm going to say for me, Kano right now, it's going to be top 3. 2 decks left to cover, and honestly, these last 2 to round out the top 5 for me were pretty, I would say contentious, but I was definitely looking at options. I think there's probably 4 or 5 decks that I think could slot into these last 2 of the 5 slots when it comes to the best, or maybe not the best, but the best options for ProQuest season. And I'm going to lead off and forth with Prism. I think Prism just lost a bad matchup in some ways, and I'll get into that in a little bit of a second with Dromai. But also, I think Prism is quite powerful. During testing, it looked quite scary. I think, honestly, the Kayo matchup is not particularly great for you. I know people have kind of a classic flesh and blood thing, right? You know, people on both sides saying the matchup is great for Kayo and the matchup is great for Prism, so, or at least good for Prism. So I think there's always contention there. But one thing I think Prism does is that it can high roll, and it can absolutely destroy unprepared people very quickly, and also it can just win games that probably you would think that it shouldn't win. Now, part of that comes down to what is like a combo that exists in this deck, basically, and honestly, a combo that's actually not that hard to put together, which involves using Arclight Sentinel, your hero ability effectively, and the Figment of Rebirth, which turns into Herald of Rebirth, to effectively loop this combo. So you can banish a card from Soul, and you can put the Arclight back on top of your deck, draw up for the turn, and then play it again on your turn. And effectively, you can just kill your opponent by slowly gaining advantage, or you can effectively finish the game. Now you need a Genesis as well to go along with this to fuel your Soul to be able to attack with that the Angel of Rebirth every time, the Archangel of Rebirth, Avalon. But you can set this up, and ultimately it's actually, I wouldn't say it does easy, but it's not as hard as you might think to be able to set that up. So it is very powerful and very scary. I think when I look at this list that we're going to throw up here, this is Rob Catton's list from the Battle Hardened in the UK. That was kind of the breakout performance, the winning list for Prism, Awakener of Soul, and I think is a really good place to start. I would say in a post-Dromai world, I think I'd expect to see less poppers just naturally out there. So what I might change about this list is I might drop away some of these anti-popper tech that you have. You've got Celestial Reprimand. It might be worth still keeping that card around, but I don't know if you necessarily need it. Rob really heavily leant into auras naturally. I think you can lean a little bit back into more Heralds. I think Heralds are super powerful. They also help you kind of with Tome of Divinity. And if you can high roll Tome of Divinity turns, you can just win some games in an insane fashion just by Herald into Tome sort of thing. It's just an insane high roll that you can kind of have. I would also probably have maybe a couple of extra blues just from the testing process. When I did play or encounter Prism through our group, you might want a couple extra blues for the matchups where you really want to look for that Arclight Sentinel loop combo. Just access to extra resources really does kind of help that, but you can't add too many because you do need enough yellows to fuel the deck. So ultimately, I think the other card that's worth pointing out and kind of why Prism is just an interesting and powerful option is Great Library of Solana. You land that on turn 1 or 2 in a lot of matchups, you just get so much advantage. Even bad matchups you can turn into winnable matchups. You have access to both Imperium Rapture, which with your hero ability is a very powerful piece of equipment, but you also get Vestige of Soul, and Vestige is what you would play when you look to do the ALS kind of combo line. So yeah, I think it's super interesting. And then of course, Phantasmal Footsteps, always a very powerful piece of equipment. I think you can probably play around and maybe even play another arm slot instead of just Goliath Gauntlet, potentially, maybe a defensive arm slot. But ultimately, I think this deck list is a really good starting point. I really like it. And I think Prism is actually looking really strong, and I'm expecting to see Prism do pretty well in ProQuest Season 5. And if you have some familiarity with this deck, or you want to pick up a deck that's a little bit different, and people might not know how to play against you, you can kind of play in the unexpected a little bit. I think Prism is honestly a really, really great option. All right, last but certainly not least, I'm going to go with Dorinthea. I think Dorinthea, in the lead up to Pro Tour LA, looked in a pretty good spot. If you looked at the Talishar win rate data, Dorinthea had the highest win rate on Talishar in the lead up to Pro Tour LA, and yet people were still surprised when it was the 3rd most played deck at the event. Ultimately, 7.5%. It was quite a steep drop off after Kayo and Dromai for the most played deck at PTLA, but Dorinthea had a really good showing. 2 in top 8, 1 in 10th in the hands of friend of the show, Nick Butcher. And I'm going to show Max Klein's list. And I think the reason for this is that he's playing a pure Hatchet list, which I think is actually even better post-Dromai. I know a lot of people talked about Hatchets and how good it was into Dromai. Personally, from my testing experience in playing Dromai, I was happy to see Hatchet Dory. That's what I wanted to see. I wanted to see people flip those hatchets over when I was playing Dromai. What I didn't want to see was people flip over Dawnblade with a really strong plan of how they were going to utilize that Dawnblade. And ultimately, that's actually what I played against in round 1 at the PT. I played against Dagon White. Shout out to Dagon. Played supremely well on a Dawnblade Dory list and kind of navigated the game, close to perfectly in a matchup that's really, really tight. I think on the flip side, though, as a Dromai player, I was super happy to see the hatchets. I think, there's some scary turns with cleave and things like that, but ultimately, I think you can just kind of overwhelm them too easily, and they don't necessarily have enough poppers to be able to control your turns and control your damage. So I think the Dawnblade versions were better into a Dromai meta, and I think post-Dromai meta, what I'd be looking at particularly. So this for me, this number 5 is a real post-Dromai meta, is this hatchet list of Max Kleins. Now, of course, with that, I would maybe even look to change this list up a little bit. Maybe you don't need these amnesias or all of them, or the down and dirty, for instance. You can potentially cut back on some of those things. Add some cards for some warrior mirror matches, maybe some more shunts, whatever it might be. And you could even look at some things, maybe even more cards into Kayo. But I think the reason to play this is it has a good matchup into Kayo. It's really hard for Kayo. You defend super well, and then you can put together these kind of big turns with Spilt Blood. The one card that I think is also a really strong card in these decks is Steelblade Supremacy. Steelblade Supremacy with the Spilt Blood can have these massive kind of over-the-top big turns. I think that's an option that you can sideboard into certain matchups, particularly matchups where you are looking for bigger turns as opposed to maybe the value grind. But ultimately, I think Max's list is obviously very, very good. Took it all the way to a Pro Tour final. And I think in a post-Dromai world, this is the kind of starting point I'd be on. I love seeing all these warriors playing Hold the Line. I think that card can feel a little bit clunky sometimes, but into matchups like Kayo in particular, matchups where people are drawing these cards, Hold the Line is really, really strong. Even has the Ripple Away tick, something that we played in Dromai for the anti-agility tick. But I think this list is a really good starting point. One thing I would say is Grains of Bloodspill, I think, is a very powerful card. Now, I understand the Tunic is really there to make sure that when you have these 3 hatchet turns, so you get to attack 3 times with the hatchets, you have the resources available to be able to do that. Plus, make sure you have the go again off of a low card count. But often on those turns, you're kind of playing off a 4 or 5 card hand anyway, and you kind of have the resources. But what you might not have is the resources on a future turn. And I think Grains of Bloodspill is really, really good for that. So I was surprised to see Max not playing it, but Max knows best. 100% understand. But I think it's a card that I might particularly look at, and it might even sort of get better post-Dromai. So I do like that fridge element of that card as well. So that's just one change I might look at, and maybe cut down these poppers. But as I say, I think this Hatchet Story is looking in a really good spot, and I think is a perfect kind of number 5 in this top 5 decks to play for ProQuest Season 5, because it is a little bit of an unknown quantity, I think, in terms of where it might go post Dromai world, with people maybe thinking that hatchets are better into Dromai. Maybe they might default back to Dawnblade, but my experience has been it's the opposite, and I would probably be going more after these dual weapons after Dromai hits out. That's going to do it for this 5 decks to play for ProQuest Season 5. I do think these are 5 of the best decks in the format, particularly in a post-Dromai world. As I keep saying, I hope this pre- and post-Dromai kind of chat on how to look at deck lists has helped. Let me know what you think about these 5 decks. Do you have a different view? Where's the Azaleas? Where's the Guardians in particular? Let me know your thoughts. I'm interested to see what happens in ProQuest Season 5. These are the decks that I think are kind of positioned the best, and decks that I think I would pick up and play. I'm looking to probably play Kassai, I think, is the deck at least for week 2, probably the first kind of ProQuest. Week 1, I'm probably not going to get to a ProQuest. If I did, I might just honestly play Dromai for the last week. But I think it's really hard to go past Kayo. Kayo just has such a good matchup spread, so I really do think that through ProQuest season, Kassai and Kayo are going to have some of the best results. But there's some outliers there. I really expect Prism to have a good season. I think that Dorinthea is live there. And then even we might see some things from the Guardians, but I just think Guardian is a little bit poorly positioned, especially after Dromai is gone. Although if we do see a massive rise up in Dorinthea, then get your Victor cards back out, get your Clash cards out. If you like this video, make sure to like and subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments, and really appreciate all the support. Until next time. See you then.